Where in the world did we get off track? Where did we go wrong? Because remember, we got to diagnose the problem so we know how to fix it and get us back on the track.
This is Republican Speaker Mike Johnson, who is a fundamentalist Christian nationalist and a writer for the religious propaganda network known as Answers in Genesis. Now, somehow, this nut is second in line from the Oval Office. In the previous episode of this playlist, I spoke with constitutional attorney Andrew Seidel about Johnson's attempt here in this sermon to revise history, to cast the United States as if it was a Christian nation by citing the witch-burning colonists of Salem and other sources prior to the founding of our secular government, rather than quoting the skeptical deists among the founding fathers. The United States was famously the first secular nation in history, a fact which enabled our Constitution to afford rights that no other system of government ever could. And consequently, other nations seeking to be more progressive have followed our example, while the religious conservatives in this country have caused us to fall away from the standard we set. Because religious dominion has never been about human rights. They want forced conformity to authoritarian dictates, the very opposite of everything the United States was meant to achieve. Johnson's game in this presentation is to first convince his church congregation that America is a Christian nation, despite what all the actual historians say. And why does he say that? George Orwell explained that in his book 1984, when he said that who controls the past controls the future, and who controls the present controls the past. Meaning that if Christian nationalists can control enough of the popular culture, then they can revise our history, literally teaching false propaganda in public schools, which they're already doing. And then they can pretend as if we got off the track that they were never on, and that they're going to set us right by undoing our constitutional republic and replacing that with a theocratic autocracy such as the founding fathers tried to prevent. And how do these regressionists intend to do that? Well, since their belief system is based entirely on lies, as are all of their religious apologetics, then so is their political propaganda. So they're going to lie. That's what Johnson did all through the previous part of his speech, and that's what he'll keep doing through this episode too, and throughout the rest of this playlist as well. I'll point out and correct each of the falsehoods as they come up.
Now, here's in one slide I want to summarize for you real quick where we began to get off track. If you show me the next one, the best way to describe it is that we had a series of cultural shifts in the country. Okay, now what does that mean?
Notice how he asks if what he just said is okay. He's subconsciously asking, do you believe me? Because he's trying to establish a narrative to guile you, and he wants to know if you're following the ruse. So he'll end a premise with okay, or he'll say right, right, because in order to mislead you, he has to lead you on. There have been cultural shifts in American history, but in the opposite direction of what he says. He wants you to believe that the founders of this country were so very Christian in 1776, but that we've since started sliding down the slippery slope to secularism. Many of the founding fathers were technically Christian, but few of them were like Christians we have today. There weren't many Trinitarians among them. They were more Unitarians, and there were several deists, which are only a step away from atheists. Some of them were even agnostic, which is why our founding documents are so vague about who or what their creator might be, referring specifically only to nature's God, which is a deistic notion, but one that Christians and other faiths can accept as well, being inclusive, The founders were all very well read in history and philosophy. Any idiot can write a book nowadays, but back then it was a lot harder, and authors had to be better at it. Many of the books that are written today wouldn't have been read back then. The founders were scrupulous thinkers. Don't forget that Thomas Jefferson revised the Bible by removing all the supernatural stuff that he found so hard to believe. The founders were profoundly philosophical and political scholars and deep thinkers. And today we'll get an occasional Ivy League magna cum laude political science scholar, but beyond that, modern politicians are not celebrated thinkers like some of our founders were. And many of our politicians now are more fanatically religious than the founders ever were. So we didn't start off the way Mikey wants you to think we did. And the trend is, sadly, moving in the opposite direction of what he says it is.
So sometime around the mid-1930s, roughly, there began to be kind of the emergence of the culmination of a movement that had begun in America. Now, there are a lot of things going on around the world at the time. It was kind of a sort of a new modern Enlightenment era, as it were, and men were becoming very, very smart, right? And so we decided, the academic elites in this country and some of the Supreme Court justices, Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes was one of them who led this movement among the academics, and they decided, they're reading Darwin and all of his ideas about creation and that we evolved from primordial slime and all the rest, and they're thinking through the implications of all this, and they said, now listen, here's the thing. If all that's true, there really probably isn't a God anyway. Right? There really isn't a creator, because we evolved and we become so smart now. We recognize that the universe doesn't center around God. The universe centers around man. Man is the center of the universe.
Notice the irony that defenders of the faith only ever argue in bad faith, always misrepresenting the opposing position. From an atheistic, skeptical science perspective, man is not the center of the universe. There is no center of the universe, but if there was one, it wouldn't be us. As many godless philosophers have already pointed out, we live on an insignificant planet of a humdrum star lost between two spiral arms of the outskirts of a galaxy, which is a member of a sparse cluster of galaxies, tucked away in some forgotten corner of the universe in which there are far more galaxies than people. It is Christians who pretend as if the whole universe was created just for us, and therefore we are the center of the universe and the reason that everything exists. Religious apologists love to project their own faults onto others, as if everyone else is doing what only the believers do. Mikey lied about Darwin's ideas for creation, too. For one thing, Darwin never expressed any ideas of creation. At most, he wondered whether, life might have begun in a warm little pond. But that's a far cry from the hypothesis of primordial soup, which wasn't proposed until a lifetime after Darwin died. Additionally, evolution isn't one of Darwin's ideas. It's a fact that he was one of the first to point out and explain. And we know so much more about it now that if Darwin were revived somehow today, he would have to go back to school to catch up. Religious extremists also tend to embrace paranoid conspiracy theories, especially those concerning powerful mystery entities like academic elites, because the faithful are fearful of those who are very, very smart. That's why believers cling to scriptures saying that wisdom is foolish and only the fools are wise. We don't know who any of these professors of wisdom are. Mikey only gave us one name. He said that Oliver Wendell Holmes was one of the leaders of this atheist cabal. Except that Holmes was a believer himself, who said that the greatest act of faith is when man decides that he is not God. So again, we see that even the alleged leader of this grand conspiracy of academic elites does not believe that man is the center of the universe. No one believes that. Mikey lied about all of that.
And so you remember when the founders said, God's up here, he's transcendent, and they're all men, they're down here. Well, they just erased God from the equation entirely. They erased him.
None of that ever happened either. And don't forget that our second president, John Adams, and his entire Congress unanimously said in one voice that the United States is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion.
Well, what happens if you don't have the ultimate creator and judge up here?
Our third president, Thomas Jefferson, said that it didn't make any difference to him whether men believed in many gods or in no God. In any case, in our constitutional republic, political power derives from we the people, not from anyone's idea of deity.
It means then that everything comes down to the level of man. So in other words, if there's not an ultimate authority who's telling us what's right and wrong, what's good and bad, who provides for us the instruction manual on how to order our lives individually and collectively and as a society in the city in which we are exiled, then that means that man gets to make all the decisions.
And so it has always been, even under the old system of theocracies and the divine right of kings. If there was an ultimate authority, it doesn't tell us what was right or wrong. And at most, God will say that, thou shalt not kill. But then by the next chapter, God commands his people to kill every man and his brother. So he contradicts himself all the time. We have no idea. Is it moral today, but only on Thursdays? Or is it only when you say? So it's entirely arbitrary. If God meant to give us an instruction manual for how to live our lives, then why doesn't the Bible do that? Why does it tell all these irrelevant stories instead? Fables that we know for certain are not true. If God existed and he meant to tell us what is good or bad, then rather than give us his judgment on any of billions in a list of hypothetical situations, God should instead tell us how to discern for ourselves whether something is good or bad. Why is it right or wrong? But the Bible never says that. As always, in every situation, we were left to figure that out for ourselves. If you have a clear definition for what good and evil are, and you have an established set of criteria that determines that, which I think we do, then that is an objective standard. Whereas authoritarian dictates do not have an objective morality because they have to rely on whatever the authority says in each case. It's not down to the qualifying reason why, but rather the subjective opinion of whatever self appointed prophet is pretending to convey the subjective opinion of God.
Now, think through the implications of that, right? There's no absolute right and wrong anymore. The people get to decide it.
There's another lie. We, the people, have always decided this, even before this country was founded or before this continent was discovered. We always knew, everyone everywhere always knew that it is immoral or wrong to cause unnecessary harm or suffering in someone else, especially the innocent. Absolutely everyone understands this globally accepted social norm. So there is an absolute right and wrong. Mikey lied about that too. Of course, people can still be selfish and cruel and will be due to dynamic chemistry and cultural conditioning or what have you. But they also know that if they want to get away with it, then they'll have to make up excuses in an attempt to justify the evil that they do. And those excuses have historically very often been based on political or religious righteousness. Because, as some have already noticed, belief in God doesn't make anyone good, and atheism doesn't make anyone evil. People can be good without God and still be evil in the spirit. But to get good people to do evil, that takes religion.
And by the way, your rights don't derive from God anymore. Your rights derive from the state or the highest human authority at the time, be it a government, a parliament, a king, or a tyrant. It all comes down to the level of man.
As it has always been. It was not God who waited until a century ago to decide that women and Native Americans should have the right to vote in this country. It wasn't God who granted women the right to choose in 1973, and it wasn't God who turned around and denied them that right a year ago either. It wasn't God who decided that women could only have the right to drive or own property or have agency in these countries, but not in these other ones, particularly those ruled by religious law, where rights are always restricted. The right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness have all been commonly denied by Abrahamic religion, especially. And Abrahamic religion has historically violated every amendment of the Bill of Rights, because none of these rights, nor indeed any other rights was ever given by God. Every right people have ever had was granted and either preserved or denied by human legislators, not by any God.
Now, there's some very serious implications that come from this. Now, somebody said one time, and I can't remember who it was, what we tolerate in moderation, our children excuse in excess. What we tolerate in moderation, our children excuse in excess. Now, what happens in the 1930s when they begin to write this into the court opinions, the Supreme Court on down? It goes down to the lower federal courts. It makes its way onto the university campuses in academia. It makes its way ultimately to K through 12 curriculum in the public schools. And they begin to teach a generation of Americans that there really isn't any God. There really isn't any right and wrong. You get to make these decisions yourself.
Except that academia has never collectively taught that there is no God. No textbook, no syllabus, no lesson plan from any university ever said that. Mikey lied about that too. I would even venture that no professorial lecture ever said what he said they all do either.
It went by lots of terms. We used to call it legal pragmatism, legal positivism. Now we refer to it as moral relativism.
On a cursory reference, legal pragmatism views law as produced by specific social contexts and focuses on the consequences of judicial decisions. Legal positivism is something else. It's the thesis that the existence and content of law depends on social facts and not on its merits. Moral relativism is the view that moral judgments are true or false only relative to some particular standpoint, for instance, that of a culture or historical period, and that no standpoint is uniquely privileged above all others. None of this has anything whatsoever to do with teaching that there is or is not a God. Not that it matters, because no academic institution ever taught atheism as fact anyway.
So it takes hold in the 30s. They teach it to a generation of Americans. What happens when you fast forward 30 years? Well, you wind up in the late 60s. Now, some of y'all are around in the late 60s. You remember that, what that was about. The countercultural revolution, Woodstock and drugs and peace and free love and all that, but more about the undermining of the foundations of religion and morality.
Oh, no. Not peace and love. Good music and good times? Anything but that. Let's go back to when religion ruled over us all, when art and fashion and everything always sucked for everyone, because religion doesn't offer any foundation for morality. Oppression, suppression, and bigoted immoral intolerance amid willful ignorance is what you had, not morality. In fact, as I've so often said, anyone who uses the Bible as their exclusive moral guide would be a criminal in every country on this planet, because comparing the culture of theocracy in the Bible to that of modern first world nations is a fine example of moral relativism, where what they found acceptably just and righteous in that culture are indefensible atrocities in ours.
Because if you remember, in the late 60s, we invented things like no-fault divorce laws. We invented the sexual revolution. We invented radical feminism.
Except that in the 1960s, there was only first wave feminism, which not even anti feminists would consider radical anymore, unless you're a propagandist who has to put the word radical in front of every concept that you can't bear and don't dare to seriously consider. Imagine even allowing yourself to understand why unfair double standards should not be arbitrarily imposed on the basis of gender. We can't have that, because then women might get the idea that they're like regular people rather than cattle, commodities, properties, or pets, like the Bible says they are.
We invented legalized abortion in 1973, where the state, the government, sanctions the killing of the unborn.
And a wise move that was, too, for so many reasons. This is a much deeper subject than Mikey is prepared to ponder, but for the moment, just imagine the situation of telling a 10-year-old rape victim that the resulting fetus from a defective criminal inside her will not develop a brain due to some other defect, and therefore it cannot survive on its own, but that we're going to force her to carry it to term pointlessly anyway, even though we know the life-threatening and physically disfiguring risks, all because some ignorant religious authority thinks that such injustices equate to morality. Or if she's forced to have the kid anyway, one that can survive, then it's on its own, up for adoption without a family, while conservatives cut all beneficial welfare programs.
No neonatal care, no daycare, no Head Start, no school lunch, no food stamps, no welfare, no nothing. If you're pre-born, you're fine. If you're preschool, you're fucked. You're fucked.
All these things happen because, as collectively as Americans, we began to get together in growing numbers and thumb our nose at the Creator and say, we don't believe that anymore. We're rejecting the founders' natural law philosophy in favor of moral relativism, and we are going down another path.
No one is thumbing their nose at your magic imaginary phantasm. We don't subscribe to moral relativism either. We're not trading with some isolated tribe. We're a communal collective where the same laws and standards should apply to everyone. Where it is unjust, where those who identify with this or that religion get to claim special privilege over everyone else just because of the label they wear or what they pretend to believe. The natural law philosophy is that people have intrinsic values that govern their reasons and behavior. Religion denies this. Mikey denies it. But our legal system still embraces this idea to this day, even better than we did in the beginning at the founding of our nation, when many religious leaders couldn't even agree on whether certain groups of people qualified as fully human. We got over that, and we're doing much better than we ever did before.
Now, what we tolerate in moderation, our children excuse in excess. What happens when you fast forward another 30 or 40 years? Well, here's a picture's worth 1,000 words. Go to the next one for me. I mean, we know that we're living in a completely amoral society.
No, you don't know that, Mikey. I know better. We have a better system of morals now than we did 100 years ago or even 50 years ago. And if it wasn't for the evils imposed by the so-called moral majority, we'd be doing better still.
And so people say, how can a young person go into their schoolhouse and open fire on their classmates? Because we've taught a whole generation, a couple of generations now of Americans, that there is no right and wrong, that it's about survival of the fittest, and you evolve from the primordial slime. Why is that life of any sacred value? Because there's nobody sacred to whom it's owed. None of this should surprise us.
Mikey is so full of shit, he's like a colostomy bag that needs changing. First off, you got to reach back decades to find the one example out of so many hundreds by now where two high school students pretended to be Nazis and evolutionists, not realizing that the Nazis and the Ku Klux Klan, for that matter, were both entirely Christian creationist groups. Those kids were fed lies about evolution being evil, and they wanted to appear as evil as possible in their ignorance and insanity. Otherwise, what's wrong with being among the fittest? If you're alive now, that means that you descend from a long lineage of winners, a continuous string of successes culminating in you. Be proud of that and keep it up. There is far more value in the life of one who has arisen from humble beginnings than from one who was taught that they were a fallen sinner who must beg forgiveness just for existing against their will, and all of it through no fault of their own. No secular school ever taught that there is no right or wrong. On the contrary, secular schools teach a body of ethics that are far superior to the so-called Ten Commandments. This includes a value for human life that is higher than anything the Bible says on that topic. We don't say that the value of human life is sacred only because sacred means connected to God, and there evidently is no God. Asserting otherwise, contrary to the evidence and against the evidence to the contrary, would be dishonest, though that is what religious faith is and does, which is why apologists like Mikey here have to lie in defense of the faith. These are not all just a matter of conflicting opinions. You can look them up yourself and see that much of what Mikey says is factually false. And as you'll see in upcoming episodes dealing with the rest of his sermon, his misinformation, his political propaganda is potentially and deliberately dangerous.